Hey there, welcome to LSAT Demon Daily. I'm Kevin, and I'm joined by the lovely Ala. We are both teachers at the LSAT Demon, which you can find at lsatdemon.com. Today's discussion focuses on grit, which is a scary sounding word, but an essential characteristic for any person trying to achieve their goals, especially if you want to be a lawyer. There'll be lots of opportunities for you to express your grit. And if you're listening to this episode right now, it is extremely likely that you have experienced grit before. So, Ala, what is grit? Why are we talking about this?
Yeah, so we wanted to bring this up because Kevin and I sort of realized that we were, as we're calling it, patrons of the long shot when it comes to the LSAT, right? For some people, the LSAT takes maybe a year tops, right? Maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months, 8 months, about a year, right? That's, I think, where a general majority of people tend to fall. But there are
Yeah.
those of us, like Kevin and I, where it's been more of a saga. We've basically have a Marvel franchise now. I think we're on like phase 56 or something, right? We did this for a really long time. And we're going to get into what our journeys were like in a minute, but we wanted to do this episode because we want y'all to know that we know how it feels to be doing this like day in and day out, month after month, year after year. And we want you to know that you're not alone. So we thought we'd record this episode to share some of the aspects of studying that kept us not just motivated, but also bought into the process. So let's kick things off with a little bit of background on our journey so that like our audience understands that we really do get it. So Kevin, what was your LSAT journey like and how long did it take? That kind of stuff.
Yeah. So my journey was about 3 years. I started in 2019. This was the spring of my junior year of college, and I thought, you know what? If I can knock the LSAT out here before my senior year and apply during my senior year, then I could just go straight into law school and everyone's hunky dory. We can keep going. So, um, but I didn't get the score I wanted. I ended up getting on my first LSAT attempt the same score as what I got in my diagnostic, which was a 153. It's not a bad score at all. It's just I knew I could better. And so in the successive years that followed, it was an off and on relationship. I would study for a while, I would take the LSAT, and then I didn't get the score I wanted, and then I'd take a short break, get back into it, and do the process over and over again until I finally got the score that I wanted. And I think the hardest part for me, we'll talk about this later too, but that held me back was just I had high expectations for myself and basically had a introduction to anxiety and now realize that I possess a certain type of anxiety that is very common among people, and it's a totally normal thing to have. But I just didn't recognize it at the time, and eventually overcame that anxiety, overcame these hurdles, and eventually reached my goal score. So I guess again, we'll talk about this later. It was kind of I knew I could do better. I had high expectations of myself. I had a strong support network within my family. There's a lot of hard work, obstacles in the way, but there's still some sort of positivity in the background that I could cling on to. So, if you want to hear more about my story, there is another podcast episode. Maybe we'll have it linked here in the episode notes. But I basically did a Cornell Notes version of what happened. So, what about you, Ella?
Yeah, I really like your journey, Kevin, and I think it's actually sufficiently different from mine that like people get like a different sense of like what like we were both doing the same thing at the same time. We didn't know each other, right? We even ended up
Yeah,
taking our first official LSAT at the same time in the universe, and we didn't know it, right? And so
yeah,
we
very
did
freaky.
this separately and we were working through the same or at least similar types of obstacles. And we sort of got to the same place at the end, but it looked different for us as we went along, right? My journey was far more on and off than Kevin's. I think Kevin was a lot more consistent through his 3 years. I studied for 4 years on and off, and there were like large gaps in between due to personal reasons, due to just like life happening. We also like mentioned the pandemic later in this episode too.
Yeah.
So I started studying. Actually, I was one of Nathan's in-person students back in 2019. I took like one of his classes at in San Francisco, and then I studied for about 5 months, like through that course, and then like a little bit by myself too. And then I took the same test that Kevin took that year in 2019. And then I got a score that was like, you know, like 10 points above my diagnostic, I think roughly. And it was good. I was making progress, but then I was studying like 5 hours a day and I was like doing nothing else. I didn't have a job and I like had gotten out of undergrad and then, you know, was trying to find myself a little bit. I didn't have a lot of things to hold on to, but I started applying for jobs and I got a job just as I was finishing that round of studying. And I was so burned out from that whole process that I basically just like didn't go back to studying for quite some time. And then once I balanced out like having an actual career and like a job every day, I started like slowly bringing the LSAT back in, and then the pandemic hit, which was another rattle in my plans. And then in 2020, I started studying again after some of the real highs of the pandemic. Like was starting to normalize, right? And then I studied for about a year with one study buddy, not Beth. It was a different study buddy. Worked together for about 6 months, and then I took the test and I got something in the high 160s. I still wasn't satisfied, and then I had a personal tragedy happen, and then I had to take another break, and then I finally came back to it in 2021. I can't remember my years now. Yeah, in 2021. And that's when I found Beth and our other study buddy. And then we went at it for like 8 months. And then I finally got my score. So this was like all over the place for me. There was a lot of on and off. But like it was a total of 2 years of studying. And I had a very normal diagnostic. And it was the process was very much a long shot.
Yeah, sounds like we both had those roller coasters, highs, and you're like, yes, finally making progress, and those lows, and then we get back to these
Yeah.
highs, just oscillating back and forth all the time. And I think that's a very normal thing to
Yeah.
emphasize. Like everybody does that. Everybody goes through it, whether it's a longer journey like ours or a shorter one. It's still the same thing. So, but outside the LSAT, there are a lot of examples of this grit. And again, we'll kind of dive into more of what grit is as we keep going. But what are some examples that you have off the top of your head that, show off this grit in the real world?
Yeah. And like Kevin and I have discussed this actually a couple of times. We've talked about like doing this episode for some time now. And the thing that we kept coming back to is like we just we figured out how not to give up. And it wasn't easy, right? Like we definitely wanted to give up. And I mean, in my case, I definitely did give up like multiple times in the
Yeah.
process, right? Like we went through all of that and we found that the unifying sort of subtitle for how we did it was grit. So one of the examples, as Kevin asked, that I love bringing up and that I actually brought up in class a couple weeks ago was Hard Knocks. I know there's a lot of fans of Hard Knocks out there, and it was a very popular show. But I was introduced to the show, and then I recently watched I think the most recent season of it, which was following Dan Campbell and the Detroit Lions, who had
Mm.
a like terrible season before. Like I think it was like something like 12 losses and 3 wins or something like that, just a catastrophically bad season.
Yeah.
And it like was like heartbreaking for people. And it's obviously professional athletes that care a lot about how a team works. And then Dan Campbell comes in and he's the head coach. And the show follows sort of how they were able to rebuild. And their one unifying value system that they abide by is grit. And it's actually like written on their walls and stuff in the episode. And I highly recommend the season to y'all. I think it's on HBO if you want to check it out. But that's where I sort of like got the message of this episode, which is like, hey, that thing that got me through the last like 4 years of doing this thing, it was grit. It was the embracing the suck, I think is like a Navy SEAL book that's out there, right? The notion that does not feel good and we're still going to keep going.
Yeah. And that, it's, I think it's very important to emphasize here also that this would happen to professionals, professional athletes. These guys specialize in this sort of thing. And, as we study for the LSAT, we're trying to specialize in being a lawyer and being, using logic in our arguments and stuff like that. But,
Yeah.
you know, in some ways, we're still amateurs, and these guys are literal professionals that are experiencing the same sort of thing that you are. So it's, it
Yeah.
happens to everybody. You're not alone. And, continuing with professionals, I talk about this example sometimes. My family is very basketball oriented. Michael Jordan was cut from his high school basketball team, which is crazy. You think about that, and you're like,
Yeah.
you mean the guy who won an absurd amount of NBA rings with the Chicago Bulls in the 90s? You're like, that guy? He got cut from his
Yeah.
high
I
school
wonder if
basketball
that
team?
high school like basketball team coach like just has nightmares about like cutting him
Yeah,
from
what
the
have I done?
team.
Exactly, yeah. So I mean,
Yeah.
think about that for a second. We're not saying that everybody's going to be successful if they've been, struggling with the LSAT or whatever, but
Yeah.
somebody will. Michael Jordan, he struggled when he was younger to some degree, and he figured it out. He went through grit. He figured out how to get better, how to improve. And I have this quote here on my whiteboard. It says, "Grit is choosing to hang on when you uh, desperately want to let go." And I'm sure Michael Jordan felt that. I'm sure the Detroit Lions felt that. I'm sure the Navy SEALs felt that. It happens. I'm sure LSAT students right now are, you know, hold on, you know, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, that sort of thing. It's, you can do it. So,
Yeah. And another sports analogy we want to make, since this is, as Kevin and I agreed in our last episode, a baseball podcast, and we're
that's
both
right.
Mariners fans, the Mariners baseball team has been through this for as long as the Mariners baseball team has existed,
Oh my gosh,
right?
yes.
Like they're the only team in the MLB that has never won a World Series and never appeared in a World Series
Yeah,
either, right?
yeah,
So like the attitude of continuing to rally, of continuing to believe in something that hasn't happened yet, that feels like such a long shot. That's the focus of this episode.
yeah. And you can make that World Series someday, maybe before the Mariners, but you can do it. So, the thing about grit, though, which I also want to jump in here with, is grit is often a better predictor of success than is your natural intelligence. Because you're willing to work hard for something that, right away you're not as good at as, say, someone who can naturally understand it. But that's such a
Right.
huge quality that people look for and people, are impressed with and people are attracted to. You know, it shows that you care a lot, and caring is really important if you want to achieve your best and get your best results. So if you're going to go to a law school, I guarantee you the grit that you're going through now is going to be such an important baseline for what you experience as a 1L in law school. You're going to be on like 10 steps ahead of everybody else because you've been through the war. You've been through the weeds before everybody else. So
Yeah.
um, with that being said, what are these characteristics of grit? What is contained in grit in this entire
Yeah.
characteristic?
What do we mean when we say grit? Like, what does it look like? Like, what are the components of it? Right,
Yeah,
Kevin?
and based on our research online, it's telling us that optimism, confidence, and creativity are three really crucial elements of grit. Again, that's optimism, confidence, and creativity. And when you put those together, you get this thing called resilience and hardiness, which leads to grit as well.
Yeah. I love that. I mean, I think those are all components that like I try to hit on in my classes all the time. And they're things that, definitely impacted me. One of my biggest struggles to being able to sustain my grit was confidence. Like I did not believe that I could do it. And that also sort of goes hand in hand with optimism, right? And I wanted to make this point about optimism, which is optimism isn't just like I'm gonna get a 180, right? It's not like this sort of like blind like wide-eyed belief about the fact that like you can be the best ever. Optimism is a far more like nuanced thing, at least in the context of what we're talking about in this episode and like in the LSAT specifically. It's about believing in a future self that's better than your current self. And
Yeah,
that's different from having a goal score. What we're talking about is, can you see yourself getting that one extra question right? Can you see yourself having 100% accuracy on the first 10 questions, right? Those are notions that are like, they're little baby steps. And they are little baby steps of optimism. We're talking about a smaller goal and an actual goal of improvement. And when you bring it down from I'm going to get a 175 when this is all done with, if you can move that down to like I'm going to get the first 15 in this LR section right, I'm not going to miss a single one. That's a very different equation. The first one doesn't really help you say, coming out and saying I'm going to get a 175 doesn't actually do anything for you. But saying that you're going to try to, in the next couple of weeks, get the first 15 right, get the first 15 perfect, that is something you can work with. That's something that you can feel proud of when you do accomplish it.
Absolutely. 100%. And, for me, I felt like I had the optimism, I had the confidence, like I had these high expectations set for myself. I could do it. It was the creativity aspect that was really difficult for me. I tried. I took the LSAT 6 times. In a lot of ways, I was hitting the same brick wall over and over, trying to force my way through it. When what I should have done, maybe to save a little bit of time or a little bit of grief, was, figure out how else can I get through this wall? Can I go around
Yeah.
it under it? That old saying. So it's that aspect of, just because some other people learn this in one way doesn't mean that that's the best way for you either. It might not make the most sense, and you kind of have to experiment a little bit. It's like taking our worlds approach. We're strongly suggesting that you use worlds, but instead of doing worlds the same way that this other person did with this rule, you do it with a different rule. That's the kind of creativity I'm talking about here.
Oh, I
So
like that. I was about to ask you, like, Kevin, what do you mean by creativity and how it helped you? And it sounds like you gave me an inkling of an answer there, which is about that intuition that we teach in classes all the time, right? It's,
yeah,
can you tackle any game that comes at you in any way? Can you like deal with not knowing what a word means? It's about being able to be on your toes and like react to situations. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
exactly. Yeah. And it's, again, kind of what I was talking about before with the grit they experience now will help you at law school. It's that creativity that I didn't know I needed. Look at it things in a different way, and applying it in order to improve. That
Yeah.
is going to help me in law school because I went through the pain of it, when I was studying for the LSAT.
Yeah.
So again, with this little formula we have with optimism, confidence, creativity, which leads to resilience, which leads to hardiness, which leads to grit, all those five characteristics eventually leading to grit. If you go through these five things, maybe you go through some of them, they will apply later in life with whatever you're doing. So, and different people struggle with different things and improve on different things. So,
Yeah, I really like that point that we made about creativity though. And I want to drill down on it just one more time to say that when we say creativity, we are talking about intuition, right? That like ability to react and also the adaptability to be able to react to different scenarios that you don't see coming. And we say this
mm,
all the time when students are feeling like nervous about their upcoming official LSAT administration. And we say, expect things to go wrong,
yeah,
right? Like include that in your margin of outcomes. Like expect there to be maybe a Proctor U issue, right? Or expect there to be noises outside of your room on the LSAT, right? When you include the fact that you might miss a world while building worlds, when you include the fact that you might make mistakes or that there might be mistakes just happening around you, when you include that into your range of outcomes, what you're doing is you're being adaptable. You're being a lawyer, right? You're being somebody that is prepared for a multitude of scenarios that could happen. And I think that's a really critical component of grit, right? Being able to react to what's in front of you rather than how you wish it had happened.
yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's that you've gone through it. You need to figure out how you can adapt to it. And once you do, you're well more suited and well more prepared for whatever's coming your way in the future. So yeah, I was just say a different way of looking at these five characteristics. It applies differently to each person. That creativity aspect, is something that I didn't consider when I was studying. It's something that, a lot of lawyers have. Alla was talking about how optimism, you know, it means different things. It's not, being super idealistic and imaginary and trying to shoot for the stars, which, we encourage you to do, but not so much that you get infatuated with it to some degree. And,
Yeah.
maybe you struggle with confidence, and that's something you just develop when you study as well, and so each of these things, they are so important to helping you understand that you're dealing with grit and then overcome that grit later on, that it's
Yeah.
just different for everybody and it works that way. So,
Yeah,
um,
exactly. I love that, Kevin. I think we would be lying to you, though, if we didn't get into some of the things that we just did not like about this entire process, right? And we're
yeah,
highlighting this about like the parts that really sucked. We're highlighting this one because again, we don't want you guys to feel alone, and we don't want you to see us as like we don't want you to put us on a pedestal. I tell this to my students all the time. You guys are no different from me. There is
yeah,
not anything that differentiates Kevin and myself from any of the students that we work with, right? It just happens to be that we have the practice to be able to give you the kind of advice on the LSAT that we can, but it doesn't mean anything about like who we are as people, right? So we wanted to get into the stuff that really sucked in this process because we wanted to let you guys know that we went through very similar things that you went through. And the reason that we want to do this episode is so that you see that that is in fact built into the process. It's not something you can avoid. And trust me, we've both tried. It did not
Yeah.
work.
Yep.
Right, we're trying to acknowledge that there were a lot of tears and sweat along the way. It did not feel good, and expecting it to feel good in the process only leads to a kind of disappointment that will just continue to be a barrier for you for your growth.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Kevin,
And
what was that like for you?
well, kind of like I talked about at the beginning, I studied my spring of my junior year. I thought, okay, 2019, this is going to be great. I can get this done, knock it out, and move on to law school next year. And then that didn't work out. And I ended up dedicating the rest of my senior year, 2019 to 2020, focusing on my grades, which that's a fine thing to do. It's no problem. It's just the pandemic just happened to show up at that time, right?
Right.
And it's like, okay, that's not the curveball I was expecting. So I kind of gave up for a while. I was like, you know, I had to really recalibrate what I was going to do when I graduated because I had some idea and inkling of what kind of work I wanted to get into. And then suddenly those opportunities were just yanked away. So it was like separate from the LSAT, I had these obstacles appearing and it just kind of demoralized me. That optimism, I was lacking that optimism because there was so much other crap was going on around me. So that was a big down point for me. And then I had, I had a grandparent die right after the school year ended. And, it was just like the world's falling apart, and that's hard. And maybe that
Yeah, it's really
created some of
hard.
my anxiety that I have generally. But it was like, again, recalibrating. How do we go around these obstacles? How do we, you know, overcome what we experience? And not to say it's easy, it's not easy at all, but that's what grit is. You have to figure out how to get better at it that way. And so
Yeah.
um, there was another time I've said this in my LSAT journey. I hit 168 was kind of my stuck point. I got a 168 in early 2020, and I actually applied to law school that year with that score. So I took a break from the LSAT because I was applying. But then I realized that I kind of struck out my applications. And so I tried studying again, and I kept getting 168, 169, really close stuff to 170. And I was like, I score 170 and above in practice all the time. Why can't I do
Right.
it on the real test? And that was very demoralizing too. So that was a low point. I will not lie, tears were shed
Oh,
because I
yeah.
was like, I don't understand why I can do this on my own, but not on the real thing. And so to say now, looking back on it, great, I got the score I wanted. I'm going to the law school that I love, you know, that's awesome. But to say that it was easy or that it was, it'd be remiss for me to say that it was, just a chill ride and had a good time. It was like I had a rough time, and a lot of people experience the same thing too. So you're not alone. You've said that a lot, but it's true.
It really is. My journey and like my sort of really unsavory points of the LSAT looked quite similar to yours. In fact, like I have had panic attacks, I have had breakdowns, I have had like just let me just turn off my phone and not talk to anybody for like 3 days, like all kinds of reactions to the LSAT that just were really tough to get through. Like I hit rock bottom a couple of times and just stayed there. I was like, it's kind of cozy down here. Nobody else is here. It's dark and I like it and I'm just not going to get out.
Oh no.
Right. And I wanted to
Yeah.
quit in the low 160s for me was my point, right? I got to the low 160s. I swear to God, I was stuck there for 6 months and I could not get above a 162 no matter how hard I tried, right? And that's where the stuff like confidence, where I was just spinning my wheels and I was growing and learning. It was just my confidence was holding me back from being able to really believe in myself, into not double checking and triple checking things. And for me, the bad stuff, right? The parts of the LSAT journey that didn't feel so good, I only started like really embracing the process when I was including that into my everyday, right?
Recognizing it. Yeah.
Right. Recognizing it, acknowledging that this doesn't feel good instead of running away from it. right? I had personal responsibilities. I also lost someone in those years as well. There was grief. There were other very distressing interruptions. There were people in my life that were not on board with how long I was taking, right? There was all kinds of things that were going on. And when life went super duper wrong in lots of ways, I didn't want to prioritize the LSAT. I did not want to do that. And that was a huge, huge, thought that was bouncing around in my head. And I wanted to quit. And I did a couple of times. But coming back to it for me was one, that I really knew I wanted to do this. But the second part of it was just that I knew I couldn't get away from the bad stuff no matter what I did in my life, right? Let's say I just like dropped this whole law school thing and wanted to go do some other career. I would face the very, very similar obstacles in that life too. It's if your goal and if your ultimate accomplishment is worth it to you, then these obstacles are going to be too. And I had to link that why of going to law school with this process in like an ironclad connection. Like this stuff sucks, but I want this thing. So it's going to keep sucking and I'm fine with
Wow. Yeah. Thanks for sharing, by the way. That's,
it.
it's not easy to share your past. So that's,
Yeah.
I was just going to call on everybody else, you don't have to share your story by any means, but it's never a bad thing to talk it out with somebody else.
And I'm honest about these things because I know that all my students are going through very similar things like right now. Like I have had
Yeah.
students come and tell me about very, very unfortunate things that are going on in the background of their life. And I have so much respect for my students, some of whom are parents, right? They have spouses, they have careers, they have so many things outside in their life, some which are positive, some which are neutral, but lots of things which are negative. And they're handling all of this as they do the LSAT, much like I did and much like Kevin did. And it's the students that really do make it and make it consistently are people that are channeling grit.
Yeah. And I
So,
also want to say with all of our stuff that we just described, it's very normal reactions. It's
yeah,
nothing, it's not like, we did something that was really absurd or anything. Those are normal withdrawals or normal, like,
yep,
oh, I gotta give up. I can't do this sort of thing. That's a normal thing that people experience. So,
yep,
um,
exactly.
yeah,
And there's elements to this, right? There's elements to what held us back here. So maybe we can talk a
yeah,
little bit about that, about like the actual features of things that really pulled us back into that being in that cycle of just spiraling and just not feeling like we were ever going to make it. So can you think of anything, Kevin?
Well, I mean, I kind of mentioned a little bit right off, with my 160 scores that I had over and over, and where I was scoring higher on my own. It's perfectionism, and a lot of us are type A people applying law school. We probably inhibit a lot of, or sorry, not inhibit, exhibit a lot of these traits as well. But it's like I have high standards for myself. I want to achieve the best score that I can, and so not giving up because you want to achieve some sort of perfectionism is a very normal thing that you'd see during grit. You obviously don't want to strive for perfectionism into such an extreme, like with we were talking about with optimism to 180. Getting a 180 is you have to have a little bit of luck to get a 180 on a regular
Yep.
basis or on the real thing. But to some degree, perfectionism is a normal thing to achieve. Like going for the best that you can possibly achieve. That's kind of where I was going with that. And that was holding me back because it was like, I'm trying to achieve something that I don't know if I'm ever going to get. And I'm putting so much pressure on myself that it was holding me back in that regard. So there are ways where you can use that as a way to kick you in the backside and get you going to achieve that goal. But in the way that for a while I was looking at it as using it in a very negative way, where it's like, come on, man, you can do
Yeah.
better than that. What do that's
Yeah.
that sort of attitude.
That's the thing we say about goal scores, right? Like goal scores and this idea of perfectionism that isn't helpful at all, right? Perfectionism
Right.
has like sides of it that are helpful. Being detail oriented, caring that much can be a good thing, but there's some really insidious aspects to perfectionism. One of which is like if you give yourself a goal that's really, really far away from you, every time you don't achieve it, you're going to feel terrible. It's kind
Yeah.
of like if you told yourself, like, let's say you want to establish a morning routine, right? And you were to tell yourself, I'm going to wake up at 4 a.m.
Oh boy.
To yourself, every time you wake up, even at 6 a.m., which is a good time to wake up to establish a morning routine, you're going to feel like it's not 4 a.m. So I'm screwing up. And you
Yeah.
can't even value the fact that you did get up at 6 a.m., right? That's what perfectionism does to you. It puts a standard on you such that everything you do is going to feel like a disappointment.
Yeah. Yep. I love that example because that's
Yeah.
something so I don't want to say watered down, but it's so much more simple than the LSAT. The LSAT's very complicated. So yeah, I love
Yeah.
that example. One more thing that I also, if you indulge with me here, that
Yeah.
held me back was my mental health. I didn't recognize that I was going through anxiety and other things like that. And in some ways, me going through the LSAT and this pretty rough experience is that I could take better care of myself in the future. I realized this is something that I can improve myself on. And for whatever I do in later life, whether it's being a lawyer or not, I understand I have anxiety and I know how to take care of myself now to be a better person and to feel better and stuff like that. So for a while, I didn't know I thought it was just kind of a thing, but it turns out,
It's
we can
real.
take care of that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's real.
So,
I actually want to talk about another coin, another side of this same coin of mental health. For me, it came down to a lot of how I interacted with people. For me, I was terrible at saying no to people. I was a very much like a
mm,
people pleaser person, and I still kind of am. But that side of my mental health, getting a grip on how I was prioritizing myself with respect to other people, how I like figured out how to say no to certain things so that I could prioritize the LSAT, right? All of those things were part of growing up. One of the things I feel like I don't talk about enough in terms of how long the LSAT took for me is that it gave me time to grow up,
yeah.
right? I'm now going to be entering law school with a like having done multiple jobs, having had the experiences of really struggling with the LSAT, of like knowing how to manage my life, pay bills, like do all the kinds of things that adults are expected to do. And all of that was a learning experience for me that was like pushing me forward. And that side of mental health of like people and how I interacted with them was something that really did hold me back because I didn't know how to put myself or the LSAT first. And those were all like mental health things I had to learn to outgrow that kind of thinking.
It's kind of like that saying, you take one step backwards to go two step forwards, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
It sucks while you're in it, but you know, if you
It's worth
show
it.
grit, you'll get through it. So
Yeah.
cool. So, anything else you want to add with what held you back? Um,
No, I don't think so. I mean, we've been talking a lot about the negative stuff, but there's a reason why we wanted to highlight the negative stuff is because we want to be very transparent about the fact that it sucked. But that wasn't the end of the line, right, Kevin?
right. No, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we're here. We're here right now. We figured it out to some degree, and you will too. But we're very nerdy people here, and nerdiness is a great quality to have. I just want to let you know about that too. But one thing we talked about in prepping for this episode was from Lord of the Rings. Lady Galadriel says, "What's our light in the dark?" Right? And so, what was your light in the dark?
Yeah, there were a lot actually. I feel like Chris is going to really like our Lord of the Rings episodes,
Of course
Lord
you
of the
will.
Rings
Yeah.
references, and all of you probably.
Yeah.
I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan. I think I have all three extended editions like on like Apple TV or something like
I
that.
have the
Now
I
I
have
want to
the
go watch them.
yeah. I need to watch the director's cut. I haven't seen the director's cut. I've seen the
The
anyway.
extended edition?
Yeah, I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it. I know. I've seen the normal ones and they're great, obviously, but it's like there's a lot of content I'm missing out with the director's cut. So
Okay, if I'm going to react to that, we're going to have a much longer episode than we would have otherwise. So I'm just going to move on, Kevin, but you need to
okay.
watch them. Okay.
Sounds good.
So what were my lights in the dark? So for me, it was people who believed in me. That was such a big part of it. I had people around me, and I surrounded myself on purpose with people around me that were voting and wanting what I wanted, which is to go the distance no matter what to get what I want. Right. And there were people that didn't agree with that. And I had to spend a little less time with them or not talk about the LSAT with them. Right. Stuff
Yeah.
like that. Essentially finding the Sam in your life and holding on to them because they are people that believe in you. They're people that give you the kind of support that you need. People that won't fall prey to the evils of the ring, evils
Yeah.
of things like you have to go to law school this year, you have to apply right now, or you're a failure, or you have to go to this particular school. All of those thoughts are not helpful. They don't do anything for you, and they are actually actively vying against you. So people were a huge part of it for me. Another big piece of it, and this is actually advice that came from Ben, I was in one of his classes. or maybe I was listening to a podcast episode, but I fundamentally redefined what a good day meant for me, right? And this
Mm,
does bounce off of that like perfectionism attribute that we were talking about, which is I changed how I was seeing my accomplishment. For me, that wasn't about getting a certain number of questions right. It wasn't about getting a particular score. It was in two pieces. It was one, did I learn something today?
mm,
Anything, just anything at all. Did I learn something today? And two, did I practice? Like for me, that was, I usually had like a half-hour bar for myself. So that could have meant doing a game and reviewing it, or that could have meant doing a section and reviewing it with my study buddies, right? Just a half hour a day. And did I learn something? And that made it so much easier to be proud of myself, to feel confident about the fact that I was getting better and that I was making progress. The last thing I'll mention about like the things that were the light in my dark, which was accepting that doing well was in my control, but only to an extent, right? It was my fifth attempt
yeah.
and I didn't know what I was going to get, but it was a foregone conclusion for me. I didn't care what I was going to get. I cared and truly believed before I took the test and the 3 agonizing weeks you have to wait to get the score, right? All of that time, I just was like, listen, Ala, you did everything you could, right? Kevin
Yeah.
and I are patrons of the long shot. We literally did everything humanly possible to get there. And I was like, you know what? I don't care what score I get. It doesn't matter anymore because I truly, at the bottom of my heart, believe I did everything I could. And I have to be able to accept that there's a range of outcomes that could happen. And I was fine with that. And all of those things working together were the aspects of the kind of grit that I needed to keep going. What
Yeah.
about you, Kevin?
I similar to you, I had a good support system. I had to move back in with my family because of the pandemic, and that's not a bad thing.
I
Um,
did too.
yeah. Even though maybe your family doesn't fully understand the LSAT to the same degree that you do, it is still nice being able to just say, "Hey, this is what I worked on today," and it was tough. I had a tough time, and then my parents or my siblings would say something like, but you have to go through these rough days to get better at the test. You
Yeah.
realize what you did wrong, made mistakes. I say this in my class all the time. Making mistakes in classes or when you're learning is the best thing you do because tomorrow you know you're not going to make that mistake in the future and you can improve and get
There you
better. So
go. Just that one thing, right?
yeah, just something simple like that from the sports system. It suddenly, as another Lord of the Ring reference comes in here, it was not my burden to bear, right? Other people can help me with that too. So and then I kind of touched on this earlier, understanding my anxiety, understanding what mental health really is, and because there's such a stigma that does not normalize mental health. We take so much care of our bodies, except for our brain, you know,
Yeah.
and so it's totally normal to take care of your brain. Give it a rest. If you need to take a day, just say, I'm not feeling it today. The LSAT, that's totally fine. You don't have to force yourself to study 6 hours every day or whatever. Take care of yourself, take care of whatever you're experiencing, and you can turn that into a strength. That's what I like to think that I did too. So I turned myself from a poor Merry and Pippin. They're not oblivious, but they're not exactly fully understanding of what's going on with the war until the end of the Lord of the Rings
The
trilogy, right?
best
When they're
line
starting
in
to,
The Lord of the Rings, the
yeah,
best line in The Lord of the Rings is throw yourself in next time and rid us of your stupidity. I cackle so hard every time I watch that line.
it's such a
You
good
just
line.
reminded me of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's your
I
Lord of the
love that you
Rings.
shared that, Kevin. I think
Yeah.
that like normalizing that you were talking about is you like learning yourself, right? Learning who you are as yourself, growing with the test, right? I tell students all the time that you have to accept that this test is going to change you and embrace the fact that it's going to change you because this is your 0L year. It's prep for law school. Our teachers that are in law school have said it so many times that like the test is so much like law school.
Yeah.
And we want you guys to see that these trials and tribulations that we're talking about with grit or with doing well in general is actually a training camp almost to come up with the kinds of fixes, shifts, reprioritization that needs to happen to be able to do well in school. I don't know about you, Kevin, but I'm feeling so much better about the prospect of a very difficult 1L year, having gone through all the stuff that we just talked about,
Oh yeah.
because it doesn't feel as scary for me.
It's like reuniting with an old friend, even though they're not really your friend. you've seen them
Oh, that's
before.
perfect.
Yeah. You've seen them before. You know who they are.
Yeah.
And you're
And
like,
you've made it through. Yeah.
yep.
And it's going to be a different beast. It's going to be probably a very, very much more difficult beast than going through the LSAT, but it doesn't matter because we've cultivated these processes, these resources, these support systems. We've normalized our mental health. We've had these conversations, and all of this now has equipped us for that. And we know that we didn't touch on a lot of like strategy things with the LSAT in this episode, but that was kind of the point. We wanted to talk about everything else outside that allowed us to succeed so that you guys might be able to see that it's not all rainbows and unicorns, right? It fundamentally is not. And we don't want you to ever think it's going to be. And that was the sort of like secret in our process, is that we just didn't expect it to be good.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's a perfect
Anything
summation of the
else,
whole thing.
Kevin?
I have one more thing, and forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but if you are in our classes and you listen to this episode and you're like, you want to be vulnerable for a second and share what's going on, we are your support system. So whether that's before or after class, it's like I'm
Yeah,
guessing these students want to keep it, personal between the teacher and the student. We're here for you. That's all I want
yep,
to say.
we
We'll help
are.
you get through it.
I have conversations all the time before class, after class, right? And this isn't because, we're mental health professionals or we're experts of any kind. We're just trying to be people that also get it, right? We know how difficult it is to try to talk about this stuff with people that don't understand what it is.
Yeah.
But we have seen it before, we have been through it before, and we're gearing up to go do it again. And we want y'all to see that it is all that back and forth. It is about that process, about that support system.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks so much, Ala. Love this episode. I think this is going to be
Thank
very
you,
beneficial for
Kevin.
everybody. So if you had the grit to continue listening to us for the entire episode, thanks for being here. If you have questions or like to share some LSAT or law school admissions news, email daily@lsatuna.com. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, guys.